Hi, I'm Em.
And my name is Bea.
And this is
Fangirls Anonymous. A quick warning, this podcast is not for kids.
We get into some pretty explicit stuff.
But if you're still with us and into that, welcome.
Hi, Bea.
Hey, Em.
How's it going?
It's going pretty good today.
Yeah?
How about you?
It's been pretty good. I haven't been able to read any fan fiction today, which is a little sad.
That is tragic.
Yeah, I do love me some fan fiction, which is why we are doing this podcast. What are we doing this week?
We are going to talk about some of the complexities of fanon versus canon.
Fun.
So if any of you listen to our episode on sort of some terms that are really common, you will recognize both the terms fanon and canon. Em, do you want to maybe give a snappy pitch on what exactly those are?
Yeah, sure. So canon and fanon as concepts are really close to each other. So this is why we thought it might be a good idea to do a episode solely on the shades in between these two concepts, including our personal thoughts on it. So canon is the actual plot of a story or of an intellectual property. The shades of it, as we'll get into, can be pretty gray, but in the MCU, Marvel Cinematic Universe, what's happening in a specific movie, the summary of it and the actual things that are happening in the film, that would be considered canon by most people. And the thing is, as somebody who's watching it, your definition of what canon is versus not canon is very personal. So there's a lot of gray area to it. Fanon is, well, what do you think fanon is, Bea?
Fanon is, for the most part, it can be defined as what everybody within the greater fandom agrees to be part of the narrative, even if there is little or no supporting evidence within the canon text. And by text, I mean anything that makes up the narrative. So if it's a movie, the film; if it's a book, the actual text. So these can be things like, this may be reaching a little bit, but in the first of the new trilogy Star Wars movie, before any of the rest of them came out, people were really excited and very strongly believed that Poe and Finn were a couple. That's where they were heading, that's how the narrative should go. And most people in the fandom sort of agreed that that was something they wanted to be part of canon, or at least within their own personal narrative to be part of it. So
it was definitely a lot of people's headcanons that Finn and Poe would get together, but it was because so many people collectively agreed, it became fanon, and even the actors were like, yeah, that would be really cool if that was a thing. I think John Boyega and Oscar Isaac both tweeted out saying, Finn Poe forever, for life, something to that effect.
But obviously in the rest of the movies, it didn't pan out. So not canon, but fanon.
Yes, and somebody's idea of whether that could have been canon before the two movies afterward came out is strictly fanon, but a lot of people would have argued that it could be canon, so it might be canon. Mm-hmm. And what is your definition of canon then?
Which
because
is really,
if there's evidence to suggest something that does exist, is that canon?
Which is really where the complexity starts coming in, because like Em said, at what point is there a difference between fanon and non-canon compliance? Because if it happens after canon already is finished or before more canon is produced, up until that point, was it theoretically canon? Was it just wishful thinking?
A lot of people would say it's wishful thinking, but the people who think that this is important, including the audience of this podcast, I think that if you see something happening or budding or growing inside of a story that you really love and the next installments haven't come in yet, I don't think it is wishful thinking. I think it's fanon to its truest definition.
I guess segueing from that, let's say that most people would agree that it's pretty clear that if it hasn't happened yet, but you have thoughts as a fandom on it, it's fanon. What about if I have a piece of media that has the same narrative told in different mediums at different speeds? So an anime and a manga, or a comic book and a movie.
Or a book and a movie.
Or a book in the movie. And I, a fan, am reading whatever medium is being produced faster. So let's say that before the Winter Soldier movie came out, I had already read the entire Winter Soldier comics arc. So I knew what was supposed to happen, I knew who everybody was, and I wrote a fic based on that. And then I watched the movie, which is slightly different. And suddenly some of the things that I put are no longer canon based on the movie. Is that fanon that I put in there, or my own personal headcanon if it's not widely accepted? Or is it still canon because it went along with what was in the comics?
Canon compliant. Because it's not like you were just rewriting the story, right? From the comics.
I hope not, because that would be strange.
Be super boring. Yeah, canon compliance and canon non-compliance is a thing in this too. Like, what sucks is when you're writing a canon compliant fic, but then a next installment comes in and it's totally ruined. Didn't you say that was like a Jossism or what?
So
what
there's a fun term for that particular phenomena where you're writing a fic and then something else in canon comes out and it suddenly what you wrote is completely different and could never be canon compliant. It's called Jost, and it is after Joss Whedon, and it is because he is sort of famous within fandom circles for having a narrative going what everybody thinks is one way, and then his narrative takes sharp left and everybody else was still going straight on ahead. So
like when Clint has a family and a farm.
I'm not actually sure he was responsible for Age of Ultron, but that is a good example of being Jost.
You're right, he might not have been. Gosh dang it.
I think a more classic example using actual Joss Whedon media would be Buffy's relationship with Angel. It was set up from the get-go as sort of this in-game relationship, and if you've ever watched Buffy, which I hope I'm not spoiling for anybody, it's been out for a while, that doesn't end up really panning out, and at some point she ends up getting with Spike, who was originally a villain and had a completely different long-term relationship with a different character. So
you spoiled it for me.
Sorry. But again, the canon took a sharp right turn, left turn at the intersection. And everybody else was sort of left a little bit hanging if they thought that for sure Buffy and Angel were going to be their only true loves. It was to the end of the series. Wow. On the flip side, if you are writing something in a fic and it ends up being exactly on point, canon compliant, despite you writing it before, that's called being Kripke'd. After Kripke, last name, cannot remember his first name, who wrote for Supernatural and is known for essentially playing into sort of what fans wanted or expected, a la a musical episode.
Yes, definitely. Hilariously, my rec for Rec Corner this week is a Kripke. I didn't realize that was even a term until right this instant. So, yes, it's tough when something changes when you're writing a fic, or you just put out a fic and then, you thought it was canon compliant, but it's not.
There's shades of complexity to canon that are sometimes hard to pick out, especially when there's different media that tell the same narrative.
So when you are in a fandom and there's a book version and a TV version, or a book version and a movie version, or something along those lines.
Manga and anime do this all the time.
Yeah, all the time. A universe in which I am very familiar with is the Good Omens universe. There's the book, and then there is the TV show. And the people who made the TV show really tried to keep the spirit of the book in the TV show as much as possible, and it's great. If you are listening to this and you haven't watched Good Omens, please do yourself a favor and get access to the show. It's wonderful. It's on Amazon Prime. But the stories are slightly different because it's two different mediums. It's a book versus a 6-episode TV show. Mm-hmm. And the endings are slightly different. The characterizations are slightly different. But they're both the same story, essentially. They're both in the same fandom. But when you write a fic, a lot of times, fic writers like to tag whether it's a book fic or a Good Omens television show fic. Does that mean that one is more canon than the other? We don't know. That's kind of like asking whether a tree makes a sound if it falls down in the middle of a forest and nobody's there to hear it. Like, there's really no right answer. Of course, the people who read the book first, like me, would say that the original book, the original source material for the book, is most likely canon. But I would never say that the TV show is not canon as well. Because I really like that story too. I really like those characters. I really like where they took the story and the characters and the soul of the book and just like turned it into this beautiful visual spectacle and emotional story. I love that they did that. But some people would not consider it canon because it's not the true original concepts. But I don't know where a line is between those two. I think a lot of people would consider both of them canon, but they're different from each other. So where do you decide whether one thing is correct or the other thing is fanon, right? One thing is canon and one thing is fanon.
Mm-hmm. And there's also, I guess, inter-fandom agreements on the idea of having self-contained, connected, but ultimately self-sufficient canons. For example, let's take Star Trek the original series and Star Trek the alternate original series. So the TV show in the 60s, and then the movies that they made in 2009 onward. They both technically tell variations of the same narrative about James T. Kirk and his time on the Enterprise with his crew and the adventures they go on. But the original series is distinct and sort of self-contained, and the alternate original series, the movies, are based on them, but if you've never seen the 60s show, you could still watch them and understand the story, so technically also self-contained. And within the fandom, you tag it correctly, and it is essentially agreed that, for the most part, those streams really don't cross much. I mean, there is obviously the Leonard Nimoy cameo in the 2009 Star Trek, but even then, most people don't, unless they're doing a specific crossover and all that entails, they don't usually assume that it all works as a single piece of canon the way they might with, say, Star Trek The Next Generation, where the original series and Next Gen were technically supposed to be part of a unified narrative. So you could sort of mix and match as you wanted.
Yeah, I would say that in almost every fandom I've encountered, when there are different iterations of the same story, it's almost like two villages in the same fandom. They're in the same fandom, they're in the same kingdom, right? But they're two different cultures. And they almost never interact with each other.
Or if they do, it really is more like a crossover.
Yeah, there's an interesting comic on Tumblr that I follow about Crowley and Aziraphale from The Good Omens. The Crowley from the book and the Crowley from the TV show, from quote unquote 2 different universes, accidentally switch places, and they meet the other Aziraphale. And that's odd. That never happens in fanfic when there are 2 different iterations. It's not like people are taking one character from one iteration and one character from the other iteration and then pushing them together and then that's the ship. That almost never happens.
I don't think I've ever seen that happen. I have never seen it done as a serious emotional storyline. I am 100% sure that it exists as just pure smut.
Or crack.
Yes.
Either way.
Never done seriously. As in, somebody honestly believed that these 2 iterations should be in a relationship and have a narrative to bring that to fruition. If you're not already aware, we're not talking about drugs. We are talking about a specific genre of fan fiction called crack, which you can safely assume that we mean that it is humorous.
Yes. When it comes to the whole idea of this is the story and that means it's canon and everything outside of it, then that's fanon. That's just not true. You can illustrate that a little bit by talking about queerbaiting, I think.
So, queerbaiting is the practice of a creator consciously putting in queer elements, and I mean that in the academic sense. So adding LGBTQ plus characters, or insinuating or bringing to the forefront of the audience's mind the idea that they could be LGBTQ people, but then failing to deliver on that in the narrative in any meaningful sense. And in so doing, they attract the audience and the accolades of being inclusive and having the representation without actually having to put any of the social work in to actually have those characters. It's incredibly frustrating for a lot of people who actually want to see that representation, and it's sort of dismissive and belittling. It's sort of a cheap tactic in my opinion. But a really good example of this is Sherlock. Sherlock is a show in which it is brought up several times as a joke that Sherlock and John Watson could be a gay couple. Even in the first episode, it's brought up, I think 2 or 3 times as a joke. So right off the bat, in the forefront of your mind, you're supposed to associate these people with LGBTQ plus representation. But then as you go through the show, they never actually pay off on that in an explicit fashion. I look at the ending and see it as a homo-romantic platonic life partnership, because I don't know how else you're supposed to read two men who are supposedly explicitly not in a romantic relationship raising a child together, but at the same time, they don't ever come forward and say anything about it, so they don't have to worry about being hassled for having the inclusion, while at the same time, they get all the, I guess, brownie points for having inclusion, quote unquote, and it ends up cheapening the entire experience for the people who want to be represented.
So I read and found an interesting quote from Wikipedia, and this is what it is. Queerbaiting encourages an audience to form queer ideologies without true queer representation. And I thought that was a pretty succinct way of defining why it sucks. Usually it's a way for showrunners or producers of a TV show. It doesn't normally happen in movies.
I'm gonna point out the entire Winter Soldier movie.
Yeah, you think it was actually queer baiting though? Like, you're right. You're kind of right though. I think I agree with you.
There's a debate to be had. Please weigh in with your opinion on whether or not the Winter Soldier had queerbaiting in it. I would love to hear that.
Yes, if you have any opinions about anything that we were talking about, please email us at mandbepresents@gmail.com. It will be in the show notes. We would love to hear you talk to us about things, including, but not limited to, the concept of whether queerbaiting is in the Winter Soldier series. I think that there's a possibility that that series it was queerbaiting, but I actually have to give the benefit of the doubt to the Russo brothers in this instance. They were just trying to create a really emotional driven relationship between the two main characters in the series itself, and I think that that ended up being very representative of what queer people go through when they're in a relationship together. But it just so happened that it was between these two people and it was dudes. That's just kind of my opinion, but I'm not part of the LGBTQIP umbrella, so I am not trying to put any words in the mouth of people who are, but that's just my opinion from what I've read and what I've seen. What do you think?
On the queerbaiting issue?
Of Winter Soldier, yes.
As much as I brought it up, I too am in the give them the benefit of the doubt camp. I prefer to assume they're not, unless some pretty solid evidence can be brought forward that they are, which I feel like makes for a happier viewing experience in general.
And happier fanfiction reading, I think, too. Because I know more about queerbaiting because of this episode. Lately, when I read anything that comes from a TV show that was explicitly queerbaiting, like Supernatural or Teen Wolf or any of those shows, I get a little mad. I get mad. The people who are producers or showrunners for these TV shows, or some movies, I'm sure, they usually do it in order to grab the online force and the force of the money coming in from queer people. And it's not a good thing. They're taking advantage of people by dangling the opportunity of representation in these TV shows and then not fulfilling the underlying promise of that queer bait. It sucks. It's a good business practice, but it's not a good ethical business practice. And eventually, I think it's going to go away because people are talking about it more. There's actually a word to describe what it is now. For a long time, there wasn't really a word to describe it, but it's going to go away eventually, I hope.
Well, it falls in the same ballpark of it's not to be confused directly with, say, killing your gays. They can overlap. Killing your gays can be sort of a manifestation of queerbaiting, but technically they are two separate things. So there are other bigoted things that creators can do in regards to LGBTQ plus people. But in this case, we bring it up because it's important in the discussion of canon to say, hey, just because you had it as your fanon and it didn't end up existing in canon doesn't necessarily mean that it's queerbaiting, but just because they implied it in canon or
doesn't mean it's not canon.
Yeah, because they implied it in canon, if they don't follow through with it, it's
quasi-canon.
It's very complicated and also not super fair sometimes.
What do you mean by fair?
Narratives should probably pay off on most of the major points that they put forward within the narrative. And if your major point is bringing forth this very specific representation issue, you should probably pay off on that.
Yeah. The thing about queerbaiting is that it is queerbaiting because the showrunners and the scripts and the concepts surrounding the show, the people surrounding the show, have intentionally put in hints that these characters might be romantically involved. Possible queer characters might be romantically involved. And when a showrunner does nothing with it later on in the show, but those little seeds of an idea and those little seeds to starting of a plot, an arc in the show, are still in there, does that make it not canon? Because they're in there. Unless the showrunners have explicitly stated the opposite of those seeds of ideas, I don't think you can say that it's not canon.
Not to say that it doesn't also fall firmly in the Fanon camp. Fanon doesn't have to be non-compliant with canon. In my experience, people sort of bend over backwards to make the Fanon fit, so that I guess more people can see, hey, look, that does fill this neat little narrative gap.
Yes, I would say so. It's normally an innocuous detail that somebody has added into the canon that they really like. It's not normally whole ass relationships between characters, unlike that Finpo example that you used. Other than that, it's not normally two characters are actually in love with each other or will be in love with each other. But that doesn't mean that when a show decides to put in something that is a possibility and then doesn't follow through with that possibility doesn't exist still. It is in that weird quasi-canon, quasi-fanon zone.
I think that a lot of what we've been talking about, this idea of just because it is canon doesn't mean, or just because it is fanon doesn't mean, really is sort of, it boils down to the idea of death of the author, which, Em, do you want to explain what that is?
Yes, I practiced. The name of the guy who wrote La Mort de l'Auteur, I think I tried to say that correctly, which is the title of an essay written by Roland Barthes, The Death of the Author. He was a French literary critic and theorist. The essay was written or published in 1967, and the essence of it is Roland, I'm not going to say his last name again. Roland is basically trying to say to give a text an author and assign a single corresponding interpretation to it is to impose a limit on that text. So when you are reading a text, don't take what the author means for it to say, or don't take what the author thought that it was supposed to say as the only interpretation of it. You can't impose a limit on the text. You are supposed to put your own interpretation on it, because that's the only interpretation you can really make. Like, you shouldn't just rely on the interpretation of the author of that text, basically.
It's, I guess, a more approachable way of saying it is, if you read the text in a certain way and believe it to be hinting at a certain thing or leading towards a certain point, and you can support that within the narrative, it's there. It exists, no matter what the author says. So I feel like a good example of this is if you read Harry Potter and you see some really strong themes of acceptance, about being understanding to different kinds of people and not being bigoted and reaching out and building community. And JK turns around and on Twitter announces that the story was really about insert something that is not what you thought, because you read it, because that's how you understood the text. Your reading is true and right. And the author, who should have also read the text, her reading of it is also right. You're both right. You're equally right.
Yeah, there's never a true definition of a thing. Everything is about perspective.
And the author's perspective, no matter that they wrote the thing, is not inherently more important or more correct than yours.
That's it. That's what it is. That's really what it is.
Is important because, like we said, if you have fanon that fits really neatly into canon, and that's the way you want the narrative to go, and it makes sense to you, and it fits with your characterizations in your own personal narrative for this, then that's a true thing. That's how the story goes. But at the same time, if somebody disagrees with you, they're right too.
If you both have evidence to support your claims using the text, then you're both right. And maybe you're both wrong. Who knows? Who's to say? Not me.
Technically no one, because everybody is equally right and equally wrong.
And definitely not the author.
And that's
Death of the author.
and that's important because, again, talking about J.K. Rowling, if she comes in after the story and says something about the story, that doesn't necessarily make it canon, because that's her explaining her narrative, not what's on the page, not the actual text itself. So if she says Dumbledore's gay, but within the text you can't find any evidence to support that, or very limited evidence that could be read multiple ways, it's sort of ambiguous, technically you can say no, he wasn't, and be perfectly right too.
That's important, I think, when talking about fanon v canon, because the people who create these TV shows and the people who create the stories of all of these pieces of media that we all like to follow and we all like to be a part of their fandoms, their interpretation of those pieces of media don't matter. It's our personal opinions of these pieces of media that do matter. I happen to think that regarding canon, if you have evidence to support a claim about what a piece of media means, or why you think these two characters are together, or why you think these two characters hate each other, or why you think that the story might go this way, or why you think this background character is important or something. If you have evidence to support it, who am I to say that that's not canon? Because you have evidence. There's something in the show or the book or the movie that supports your theory. And if somebody else says the opposite concept or the opposite idea of what their theory is, using evidence from the TV show or the book or the movie, that's also canon. Why can't we have a sandbox of canon? There's no reason. And I know that a lot of people would call that fanon. But when there's evidence to support your claim, it's not exclusionary, in my opinion. Canon is not exclusionary.
I think that a good way of thinking about it is not necessarily there's a line in the sand and on one side is canon and on the other side is fanon. I think it's more like a grayscale. There's a whole lot of in between where it's probably mostly canon, but it's not 100% because you're sort of reading in between the lines here. So it's a little bit fanon. Or, it's mostly fanon, but I've got a couple of good points from the show itself that kind of support this theory.
Yeah. They're hand in hand. They're interlocking.
We could make it like the Kinsey scale and give it a 1 through 10. I think that this particular idea is about a 2 on the canon fanon scale. It's mostly canon.
I think that we literally spoke all we could about these concepts. I think. Do you want to do Rec Corner?
Let's do Rec Corner. Do you want to go first this week?
Yes, I do. So, Separate Ways by PepperPrints is my rec for the week. It is a Din Luke canon compliant / fanon fic. It was written before the meeting between Din and Luke at the end of season 2. It was written before season 2 ended. So the author had no idea that they were going to meet. In this fic, the author decided to have Luke go to Din, and because he feels Grogu in the Force, and has to prove himself. Luke has to prove himself to Din that he's a worthy opponent, and he can become part of the Mandalorian or the Mandalorian race or creed in order to be able to teach Grogu the ways of the Force. And there is some very good hurt comfort in this fic. Okay, everybody knows I'm a whore for hurt comfort. I absolutely love it. So if that sounds good to you, you should read it. It's very nice. It's long, but it's actually really not that long. I think it's less than 100k, but it's very sweet, and I do like the characterizations of the two people of the Din Luke fic.
So my rec this week is Ain't Really Quaint by Quietnight and Silentwalrus. And this one is sort of a double rec for me because the fic itself is hilarious, but I would also highly recommend Quietnight's podfic of it, just to change things up. That was also awesome. And it's a Marvel Comics fic. It's implied Steve Rogers, Bucky Barnes little bit more than implied, but it's not the focus, so it's more Jen than it isn't. But the premise is a really interesting mix of movies canon and comics canon. The author very explicitly states that they're sort of cherry picking what they want in creating the story. And so if you have only watched the movies, you're gonna be a little bit, I don't want to say confused because I don't think it's very confusing, but a little bit not what you're expecting. And comics fans, if you're a fan of DC and Marvel comics, but specifically in this case Marvel, you're probably used to the ever-shifting timelines and other retcon shenanigans, so it's sort of on par. Steve Rogers is recuperating on a farm in West Virginia, and Natasha Romanoff shows up and dumps the Winter Soldier in his lap to try and rehabilitate. And it is hilarious. It has some alternating point of view where you've got Steve, who's sort of baffled by this assassin who has been dropped on him, and he doesn't know who he is. He doesn't recognize him for reasons that are become fairly clear. The Winter Soldier, for his part, is super confused by this man that he's been left with, who's not a spy. He doesn't appear to be competent in any kind of spycraft or soldiering. He doesn't appear to have a bigger motive or orders for him, so he's just sort of confused why he's here. And this leads to a lot of very funny scenarios. It makes me laugh a lot every time I read it or listen to it, so I would 100% recommend it for those reasons, and because it definitely asks you to take a step back from looking at one specific canon, and it says, we're gonna do a little bit of what we want here.
Nice. That sounds really good, and I'm absolutely going to read it this week.
I guess that's all, so we will see you all next week
On Fangirls Anonymous. Bye!